Good afternoon. Today we take a broad jump of 40 years from our subject in the last lecture, which was a credible view of Yosemite Valley in warm sunshine, to a stylized and nearly abstract painting of the Brooklyn Bridge at night. What's the connection, you ask? Other than that both are large, both represent American monuments, and both ended up at Yale. I will try to show you that both of them assume that there's an empathetic viewer, that's you, whom the artist contrives to put in a particular location that will reinforce the expressive devices he uses, including manipulating, even rearranging entirely the location. Like the other paintings in this series, this one deserves close, slow looking and thinking. To do that in the original, you're going to have to wait a bit, because the picture at the moment is not here. It's one of the star attractions of an exhibition on the Jazz Age in Cleveland, but it'll be back here in January. In the meantime, I would like to look at it on the screen for a few minutes, and then I'll start talking again. The painting is large. It's 7 feet high. In fact, it's the biggest painting that Joseph Stella had attempted at this point, at the age of 42. It's the best known and probably the most important thing he ever did. Stella was using a distinctly personal kind of cubism, and it takes some patience to work out what it is that you're seeing. It's complex, but it's full of cues. The first thing you might notice is that it has an assertive structure. It's built on those long diagonals, those converging kind of tube-like things that make A shapes the width of the canvas. One at the bottom, kind of truncated, and the other at the middle and the top, which are tapered and recede into the picture space and come to a point just above the tower. There are a lot of thin black lines too, many of them converging diagonals, others horizontal and vertical. Well, you probably know this bridge, and you recognize that Stella derived those thick tube-like things, and the thinner lines too, from the famous cables that the roadway hangs from. And they still produce an exhilarating rush of perspective, the thick bundles and the spider web of supports. Your eye may have been drawn to the tower in the center of the painting, which includes the other distinctive feature of the bridge, that pair of pointed arches in each pier, which give it a historical flavor, a kind of double triumphal arch or a section of some vast medieval building. Well, a modern photograph reminds you that Stella has made a triple-story pier out of the motif, changing the actual structure into a soaring church tower or campanile. That Gothic image has associations with the colors here too. The blue-black of a shadowy church interior, the diffuse reds and greens of stained glass. You notice other emanations of light, particularly the loom of what looks like tunnels here, 3 of them. Now, each of those has a perspective drawing in it of converging diagonals, like tracks. The tunnels are seen at angles, but none of them agrees with the others or with the overall perspective of the painting. And to complicate matters, there are that yellow and red patch in the center between the tunnels that suggests signal lights, caution, stop. At the bottom, in the very center, is a total enigma that must have been significant for Stella. What looks like a large, faceted jewel, evidently signifying something precious, something, however, with no obvious relation to the high technology of the bridge or the city beyond. If there's anything here you could call realistic, it's the section in the center, just above the middle, and it shows the walkway, the central walkway of the bridge that rises steeply toward the twin-gated tower. The perspective of the scene, this section rather, is consistent, and it's something like what someone would actually see walking across to Manhattan at night. That rising walkway is the kernel of the experience that Stella elaborates in the painting. He enriches it and confuses it and explodes it into the forms that he's made to surround it. We notice the big diagonals that pull the composition together and focus it on the tower. And there are other large elements in the composition, too, such as the swooping curves that come up from the lower right, are mirrored in the left, picked up at the upper right, with everything contained by a curved arch above. So there's a whole complex of sub-images and ideas that's under Stella's control. Something else you might have seen in the original, but doesn't show so well on the screen here, the whole painting is muted. It is grayed down a shade or two by what looks up close like coal dust, or if you've lived in New York, what you find on the windowsill, soot. It's extraordinary to find this stuff, notably probably charcoal dust, applied this way to a painting. I mean, this is a city detritus that's not pictured, it's actually there as part of the picture itself. Joseph Stella showed his Brooklyn Bridge in March 1920. The critics had been prepared for Stella's vision of New York by a large picture that he exhibited 6 years earlier of Coney Island, which we'll look at in a minute. The critics got to the point of Stella's intentions in this painting. One of them wrote that it is not the bridge seen from without, from the East River, but from within, from the central passageway which has been left for us pedestrians. The painting, to me, is more real, more true than a literal transcription of the bridge could be. The impression it makes upon him is not the superficial impression it made upon the man who crossed it but once. It has the force which can only come to our impressions when the consciousness has been struck many times by the same phenomenon. Well, the artist who crossed the bridge many times was a 43-year-old Italian immigrant who lived in Paris and was becoming one of the leading American modernists. Half American, he would have said. He was baptized Giuseppe Michele Stella in 1877, and he grew up in Muro Lucano, which is a hill town to the south of Naples in the Basilicata. He's a relatively affluent and educated family of a lawyer. He learned English and French, and he not only read Dante, but also American literature, including Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman, who were his favorites for life. When Leaves of Grass came out in 1900, and Stella could read Whitman's exuberant poems about New York City, I imagine he felt stirred by the descriptions and also by Whitman's language. These are a few lines from his poem Manhattan. Nests of water bays, superb, with tall and wonderful spires, rich, hemmed thick all around with sail ships and steamships, an island 16 miles long, solid founded. Numberless crowded streets, high growths of iron, slender, strong, light, splendidly uprising toward clear skies. Immigrants arriving, 15 or 20,000 in a week. 1 million people. Manners free and superb. Open voices. Hospitality. The most courageous and friendly young men. The free city. No slaves. No owners of slaves. The beautiful city. The city of hurried and sparkling waters. The city of spires and masts. The city nested in bays. My city. His older brother, who had emigrated to New York, invited Giuseppe to join him and study medicine, as he had. Because Joseph showed talent for drawing and painting, instead he studied at the Art Students League under William Merritt Chase and under Robert Henry, and first became a penetrating portraitist. First of his neighbors from the enormous growing immigrant population of the Lower East Side, where he lived. He was hired to make pictures for The Outlook, which was Reverend Lyman Abbott's magazine, for an essay on Ellis Island, which came out in 1906 and was part of a national debate about the welfare and protection of immigrants, about public anxiety over whether they really could assimilate and contribute, and about whether they posed a threat to public safety. All very up-to-date to our ears. Stella's people look vulnerable, withdrawn, and full of deep feelings. At the same moment, activists like Jacob Riis were using photographs by Louis Hine of people at Ellis Island and in New York tenements for a similar purpose, to raise consciousness about a humanitarian crisis right at home. Stella went to Virginia in the winter of 1907 after a mine explosion and made pictures of immigrant laborers. Working as an illustrator in Pittsburgh, Stella saw the men who worked in the heat and the smoke of the mills, which he described later as a battlefield, ever pulsating, throbbing with the innumerable explosion of its steel mills. It was like the stunning realization of some of the most stirring infernal regions sung by Dante. As he approached 30, Stella was succeeding as an artist, but not adapting to life in New York. The climate was merciless, he wrote. Nature was excluded. The crowds were relentless, and he couldn't feel at home. So, back he went in 1909. He was exultant in Italy. He wrote, "How my spirit soared at the radiant light of this supreme happiness. Our youthful confidence, miraculously restored, gives us a deep awareness of our energy, our power, of our daring to attempt everything, to use to the utmost of all the gifts at our command." He went back to studying the techniques of earlier Italian painting and drawing, but before long he chucked them, feeling that they were hampering his independence. He said he wanted, and I'm quoting him, to reveal some big thing that belonged to me and to me only. He'd had advice that the action was in Paris, and in 1911 Stella went there, saying later on that it was the new Mecca for any ambitious artist in search of the new verb. At my arrival, Fauvism, Cubism, and Futurism were in full swing. There was in the air the glamour of a battle, a holy battle raging for the assertion of a new truth. To feel absolutely free to express this adventure was a bliss. In his first year there, he saw 3 large exhibitions that presented Cubists as well as the next generation, his own generation. Robert Delaunay here on the screen, stretching pointillism at the left in this portrait of Metzinger, and at the right, kind of exploding the Eiffel Tower. The group included Metzinger, Glaise, and Léger, artists who were also applying Cubism in new ways, pushing the boundaries of color and form and scale. He met Gertrude Stein and Matisse and Picasso, among others. And his response was to give up hope that older art was going to guide him. And he decided instead that a modern artist must try, in his words, to express the civilization he belongs to in his own time. That, of course, had been a credo of modernism for at least 50 years. For his first models, Stella didn't choose cubists or futurists. He picked post-impressionists, Gauguin and Fauve painters of 10 or 20 years before. And on the right here, he painted some competent exercises in color and brushwork. He brought these still lifes back with him when he returned from Paris to New York in 1912. And they, plus his drawings, launched his career. That year he wrote, "I consider my latest work as only the first experiments of some big thing that will surely come." At Alfred Stieglitz's gallery in New York, big things had already come. There you could see Americans in mid-career who had been to Europe. Watercolors like this by John Marin, treating New York as if it were as a kind of fractured and frenetic place. Marin made the Brooklyn Bridge into an emblem of the excitement and the vertigo that life in the city could induce. And he treated Fifth Avenue as a place where nothing stands still, not even the facade of St. Patrick's. To feel the shock of that, compare Marin's treatment of New York with those of the leading modernists, John Sloan and George Bellows, who were part of a group the critics had mockingly called the Ashcan School. For modernism for them lay in their choice of subjects, from the life of the underclasses and also the demi-monde of entertainment. There's a lot of wit and sympathy in their work and virtuosity with paint, but there's nothing like Marin's kinetic exuberance. So, when the Armory Show opened in 1913, some Americans had already sampled what advanced European artists had been up to in the previous 20 years, and they were prepared. Most visitors weren't. At the show, Marcel Duchamp got the most attention for his nude descending the staircase of 1912, which Stella would already have seen in Paris. This was a cubist exercise in multiple views, superimposed, an idea that went back 30 years to the motion studies by photographers that Duchamp had studied. But Stella must have been impressed by the stir it made in New York. Remember, he was still painting post-impressionist still lifes and fruit and flowers. Stella had also seen paintings by Albert Glaise, very likely this one in Brussels and Paris in 1911, where Guillaume Apollinaire had coined the term cubism. You see a man walking into a jumble of fragmentary buildings, large trees, with a church in the distance, all heavily stylized features of the neighborhood in the western edge of Paris where Glaise lived. The year Stella decided to return to New York in 1912 was a big one for major statements of the circle of artists who were expanding the possibilities of cubism. Stella would have been impressed certainly by this 13-foot wide painting by Robert Delaunay entitled "The City of Paris," using another classical subject, the three graces in the middle, an emblem of beauty, set against the kaleidoscopic view of the River Seine on one side and the Eiffel Tower on the other, fragmented as though they had been liberated from gravity and from conventional logic too. The Eiffel Tower, engineering marvel, icon of the new modern Paris, was a motif that Delaunay repeated and varied in a whole series of paintings, just as Stella was going to do with the Brooklyn Bridge, another engineering marvel and an icon of a great city. Francis Picabia, another French artist that Stella knew, had ideas that have to have strengthened Stella's instinct that authenticity in art depended on the artist's conveying his feelings and painting what he knows and what he values. Picabia wrote, "Everything with me is emotion. It is how I feel." Like Stella, he was thrilled by the energy of the city. Picabia said, Your New York is the cubist, the futurist city. It expresses modern thought in its life, its architecture, its spirit. You've passed through all the old schools and are futurists in deed and thought. Well, speaking of futurists, one other artist surely made a lasting impression on Stella, and that's Gino Severini, who was part of a group of Italian modernists whose name came from the title of their manifesto, The Futurists, and whose ideas stuck with Stella. They included Giacomo Carrà and Umberto Boccioni, whom he met in Paris. They all had urgent questions in common: what to paint, and what good painting can bring to the world. The futurists announced that the new world of the machine, electrified and powerful, with all of its energy and speed, could bring a more fulfilling life to everybody. Stella had been painting still lifes, not exactly dream material for the futurists, but he made a discovery in the year of the Armory show, 1913, Coney Island. He wrote later on, "For years, I had been struggling, both in Europe and America, without seeming to get anywhere. And one day, I went on a bus ride to Coney Island during Mardi Gras. Arriving at the island, I was instantly struck by the dazzling array of lights. It seemed to me as though they were in conflict. I was struck with the thought that here was what I had been unconsciously seeking for many years." So Stella describes an epiphany here, Coney Island's dazzling light, seen through a bus window, revealing to him his true calling. Well, it might have happened that way, but it seems likely that well before that, he'd seen a popular 5-minute silent film called Coney Island at Night, made in 1905 by Edwin Porter, whose great train robbery had expanded the possibilities of the cinema. I want to show you a 90-second clip. With the action here, the panning motion of the camera and the moving lights would have been a jolt to Stella, as everyone else. I mean, he wrote in 1913, "Futurism is dynamic. It strives to be absolutely free of any tradition. Its effort lies in creating a new sort of language to express the feelings and the emotions of the modern artist. The essence of life," he said, "is movement." Now, Stella saw electric lights in fantastic abundance, unthinkable and invisible anywhere else he'd been, in motion, clashing with each other, for no purpose except to thrill people. He wrote that he found this American extravagance a fabulous mine of truly extraordinary motifs for a new kind of art. He certainly recalled the Futurist Manifesto by the poet Tommaso Marinetti that praised danger, energy and aggressiveness, and also great crowds excited by work, by pleasure, and by riot. Stella had found a place that suited his own extravagant personality. His first studies of Coney Island were a leap forward in subject, but still pretty post-impressionist in style. This one is all about the joyous of colorful architecture and the constellation of lights. There are spinning whirligigs and wavy bunches of tightly packed people at the bottom. At the top, the undulating, floating black lines recall a famous roller coaster at Coney, the chase through the clouds, which was wavy in both directions, out and back. This study at the bottom shows a circular shape, as Stella would have called it a tondo, a format used for centuries of Italian paintings, mostly of religious subjects, and maybe a hint of a new kind of devotion, but certainly introducing an element of instability. Since Luna Park was so important for Stella, I need to tell you a little about it for a moment. This is one of the best known of several amusement parks on Surf Street on Coney Island, and the most phantasmagoric of all. Luna Park was magical even by day, and with towers and fountains and restaurants and games and rides. And by night, thousands of electric lights turned it into a scene that America had never witnessed before. It was raucous, with jazz playing and bright color and jostling crowds. Stella made several more pictures of Coney Island, trying out a new motif, those shard-like colored shapes like shattered stained glass, which stand in for the movement and the variety and the energy of a faceless crowd. They were rehearsals, these paintings, for the picture of Luna Park, about 7 feet square, that's upstairs. When Stella showed it, it made a sensation that rivaled Duchamp's nude descending the staircase. It was a full-on futurist painting. Stella called it my very first American subject, and he wrote about it later on. He said, "I built the most dynamic arabesque that I could imagine in order to convey, in a hectic mood, the surging crowd and the revolving machines generating for the first time not anguish and pain, but violent, dangerous pleasures. I used the intact purity of the vermilion to accentuate the carnal frenzy of the new bacchanal, and all the acidity of the lemon yellow for the dazzling lights storming all around." Well, in Stella's painting, much of this is not abstract, it's just stylized, and with some patience you can work out quite a lot of what's going on. Down at the bottom here, where the crowds are, you can see at the far left a band, and at the right of center, dancers, a mass of people, and in the middle, the hot vermilion of the carnal frenzy that Stella mentions. And there in the middle are whirling forms that anybody at the time would have associated with this particular horrific ride where you really did go over the top and upside down. You see bits of language, spokes of a lighted Ferris wheel, all whirling up towards the top, and the high lighted tower in the center, which anticipates the central tower in the Brooklyn Bridge. Stella and writers about him drew an analogy between art and music that was, and is to the point, that these painted forms, like music, can trigger our emotions without imitating anything, or picturing anything, or even explaining themselves. It's a claim made for centuries for painting, one taken seriously by many modern artists. Whistler called his compositions symphony and nocturne. Kandinsky used titles such as composition and fugue. Critics often describe Stella's work with words like dissonance and harmony, rhythm and sonority, and other musical terms. Before he took up the Brooklyn Bridge, Stella produced another large more abstract painting, which he entitled The Procession, a Chromatic Sensation. It celebrated what he called, grandly as always, Elysian lyricism of the Italian spring. You can see forms here that he's used before, and will use again in Brooklyn Bridge, those wedges or facets that undulate up from a dark zone below, getting lighter at the top, and little episodes of people doing things, and the poles that might support banners in a procession, and the long, thin black lines that divide this whole welter of floating forms into fairly discrete zones. Now to Brooklyn Bridge. You remember that Stella arrived in New York as an 18-year-old in 1896. This was only 13 years after the Brooklyn Bridge was inaugurated. It was still new when he first saw it. From the time he was a small boy in Italy, he must have heard about the project. Its audacious methodology, technology, the years of construction that it took frequently made international news. This is a German journal. The project began in 1867, and it took 20 years. It connected two great cities. Brooklyn was independent at that time, a prosperous seaport, a manufacturing and shipbuilding center, in fact, the third largest city in America for most of the 19th century, until it finally became a borough in 1898. This was the longest suspension bridge ever built, and it was the tallest man-made thing in the New World. It was conceived by John Roebling, the inventor of steel cables, who had been designing suspension bridges in Pennsylvania and Ohio. After his death, the work was carried out by his son, Washington Roebling. There were plenty of people in Stella's circle who remembered the opening celebrations very well, when 150,000 people crossed the bridge in a single day. A sort of stress test, I guess. For the opening, Currier and Ives already had a color print ready, and it stressed the breadth of the span and the great height of the towers relative to the low-rise Manhattan buildings on the other side. The skyscrapers hadn't been built yet. Soon they would be, in a great rush that went on all through Stella's time, beginning before World War I and continuing until the Depression, when it slowed down, especially in lower Manhattan. The bridge became a subject for photographers, some of them so-called pictorialists, who tended to soft focus effects with rich surfaces and a painterly look. These photographers were interested in different things. Coburn at the right was attracted to the busy commercial traffic on the Brooklyn side of the river under a great calm span. Edward Steichen on the left, looking in the same direction at night, saw nearly abstract forms, deep black, against the loom of light in the vaporous sky. Other photographers saw the daily routine of the office worker class, the men going to the office, and behind them, the women strolling on the pedestrian walk as though this were just any sidewalk. And above them, the cables, looking like spider webs in some places, and in the distance, like moire silk. Some other photographers, like the guy on the left, have captured stunts or created them for pictures, like the cable painters stopping work and posing like so many fashion models and resembling musical notes on a staff. Here's what Richard Benson, recently departed and very dear friend, saw. He was practicing the art of straight photography with perfect clarity and balance, but no tricks. He simply moved around to a point where we could see only the essentials, the web of cables, and the tower, and the arches, and the walkway. We looked at this watercolor by John Marin earlier on the left, which distorts the bridge, but not in a cubist way. He gives it a splayed perspective that exaggerates the steepness of the walkway, and he uses broad, detached strokes to convey his own exuberance at the sight of it and at the rendering of it. Stella's French friend Glaise had a more severe cubist way of abstracting and reassembling the motifs of the Brooklyn Bridge. In fact, I doubt that many of us would recognize the Brooklyn Bridge in his picture. And a couple of years later, Glaise painted a bigger composition that he called On Brooklyn Bridge, and this one must have suggested an approach to Stella, because the ideas are similar. The cables as the expression of energy, some of them making a sweeping curves and the rest straight. The vertical symmetrical composition that suggests a view from the middle where pedestrians are, and the bright concentric circles to suggest lights. But the two are also utterly different. What Glaise distills from the bridge here is a play of abstract forms, not atmosphere or mood. It seems cerebral, not intuitive or emotional. Stella's work is more complex, mysterious, and enveloping. Stella made a few experiments before tackling the big painting on canvas. This sketch of the bridge seen from the side is a lot like the one he did of Luna Park at Coney Island. It's another futurist motion study, you could say, with whirling, thrusting brushstrokes like sort of meteorite trails. This big, dark drawing could remind you of Piranesi's vast etchings of these vast imaginary prisons. You can recognize some shapes that recur in Stella's painting: the curved top, the cables, and a tower. Well, I want to read you what Stella wrote about his Brooklyn Bridge project and about what it was like to be almost 40 and still in search of his subject. During the last year of the World War, I went to live in Brooklyn, the most forlorn region of the oceanic tragic city, in Williamsburg, near the bridge. Brooklyn gave me a sense of liberation. The vast view of her sky, in opposition to the narrow one of New York, was a relief. And at night, in her solitude, I used to find intact the green freedom of my own self. It was a time when, in rivalry to the new elevation in superior spheres as embodied by the skyscrapers and the new fearless audacity in soaring above the abyss of the bridges, I was planning to use all my fire to forge a gigantic art, ill-limited and far removed from the insignificant frivolities of easel pictures, proceeding severely upon a mathematical precision of intent, animated only by essential elements. And now he really gets going. You'll hear him striving to sound like his spiritual American father, Walt Whitman, in the rolling cadences and the sort of ramshackle syntax of Stella's English. For years, he wrote, I had been waiting for the joy of being capable to leap up to this subject, for Brooklyn Bridge had become an ever-growing obsession ever since I had come to America. Seen for the first time as a metallic, weird apparition under a metallic sky, out of proportion with the winged lightness of its arch, traced for the conjunction of worlds, supported by the massive dark towers dominating the surrounding tumult of the surging skyscrapers with their Gothic majesty, sealed in the purity of their arches. The cable, like divine messages from above, transmitted to the vibrating coils, cutting and dividing into innumerable musical spaces the nude immensity of the sky. It impressed me as the shrine containing all the efforts of the new civilization of America, the eloquent meeting of all forces arising in superb assertion of their powers in apotheosis. Let me recapitulate. Stella had been seen the bridge many times, and suddenly it reveals himself to him as a weird metallic apparition. Its towers dominate even the skyscrapers. The cables are conduits bringing the divine messages from above. The cables cut the sky up into musical spaces, or maybe intervals. It's a shrine of all the great forces of America that meet here and rise up to heaven. This isn't a daytime experience he's describing. Stella's revelation is too big for that. As he goes on with the voice of someone who's been uprooted, someone who is neither fully American nor Italian, someone with dark feelings of alienation and moments of illumination. Many nights I stood on the bridge, and in the middle, alone, lost, a defenseless prey to the surrounding swarming darkness, crushed by the mountainous black impenetrability of the skyscrapers. Here and there, lights resembling the suspended falls of astral bodies or fantastic splendors of remote rites. Shaken by the underground tumult of the trains in perpetual motion, like the blood in the arteries. At times, ringing as an alarm in the tempest, the sulphurous voice of the trolley wires. Now and then, strange moanings of appeal from tugboats, guessed more than seen, through the infernal recesses below. I felt deeply moved, as though on the threshold of a new religion, or in the presence of a new divinity. Long afterwards, Stella remembered what it was like to paint the picture. He said, I lived days of anxiety, torture and delight alike, trembling all over with emotion as those railings in the midst of the bridge vibrating at the continuous passage of the trains. I appealed for help from the soaring verse of Walt Whitman and to the fiery pose, plasticity. Upon the swarming darkness of the night, I rung all the bells of alarm with the blaze of electricity scattered in lightnings down the oblique cables, the dynamic pillars of my composition, and to render more pungent the mystery of the green and red glare of the signals, I excavated here and there caves as subterranean passages to infernal recesses. I would like to suggest some ways that Stella's picture language, a kind of, as I said, homemade sort of cubo-futurism, can convey an experience that helps us to feel something like the euphoria and anxiety that Stella describes in himself. I mean, the cubist element here is the multiplication of views and perspectives rather than a single one. Stella fractures the world into parts that cannot be reassembled into a unitary view. For example, we couldn't see the bridge and the subway tunnels at once. More traditional in painting are the binaries, the opposites that are basic to picture language in the Western tradition. I mean, light and dark, above and below, secular and religious, joy and anguish, and many more. The tension between those oppositions gives coherence to the picture without our having to work at it with our rational mind. We understand that towers and tunnels, one above the other, suggest heaven and hell, without Stella telling us, as he does, that there are infernal recesses below. For me, the simultaneous mix of motifs and their shifting relationships parallel the way our minds work. When we have a big idea, a belief, a person, an image, a grievance, some idea that we keep coming to, returning to, clinging to, we're apt to be at the same time to be distracted or interrupted by stray thoughts, all kinds, by trivial sights and sounds, and we hold all of them, large and small, in a kind of mental flux. That's normal. It's how our mental processes function. In the fiction of Stella's time, James Joyce's stream of consciousness, prose has a similar kind of loose and shifting form. And in music, so does Charles Ives's polytonal writing, superimposing music in different keys, playing together. Well, while Stella was painting Brooklyn Bridge, two photographers, Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand, were shooting and editing a short documentary about New York. It shows the constant construction, people dwarfed by the new buildings, herds of them moving in unison in and out of the trains and ferries to and from their jobs. It's busy harbor traffic and street traffic. We take all that for granted, but it was still a new and distinctively American experience. The film has an archaic title from Whitman's poem Mannahatta. You heard some of that before. And it has quotes from Whitman in between scenes. This film was as important to avant-garde filmmaking as Stella's Brooklyn Bridge was to American modernist painting. We're going to look at it now. It takes about 10 minutes, right to the end. If anybody knows who was responsible for the musical score, I would be very, very grateful. It's not credited, and of course it's as a silent film. It's dubbed later, but what the source was, who the composer was, I would dearly love to know. So please tell me later, if you know. I haven't yet shown you what Joseph Stella looked like. So here are two pictures from this period: a formal portrait in profile as a man of importance in the world, and at the left, a candid shot by his friend Man Ray of Stella and Marcel Duchamp, in which you see his, gregarious side. Also, in a way, his official side, because Duchamp and Stella and Man Ray had been picked by the very serious collector and patron, Catherine Dreyer, to be the exhibition committee for the new Société Anonyme, which became a force in contemporary art in its time, and whose collection became the backbone of Yale's great collection of modern art. Stella, in other words, at this moment was at the pinnacle of the avant-garde in America. His erratic career during the next 20-odd years was punctuated by reprises of the Brooklyn Bridge. His next project was to paint another, simpler version of the composition and incorporate it into an enormous 5-part polyptych in the format of a medieval altarpiece, 8.5 feet high, that he called The Voice of the City, New York Interpreted. You're seeing it as installed in the New York Museum, where it is now. Stella's 5 panels survey the vitality of the city in a way somewhat like the film that you just saw. But it's framed as an altarpiece. It's organized like one. In the middle, the biggest panel, the skyscrapers, containing the commercial engine, you could say, of the city. In the flanking panels at the far ends, the essential means of communication and connection to the world through the port over on the left side, and coming and going over the river and the Brooklyn Bridge on the right. And in between, 2 brilliant expressions of the commercial energy of the electrified city, flashing advertisements at night. And underneath each of these panels is a kind of predella panel with a row of lights, tunnels, and under the bridge, cross-sections of cable. This is the artist who said he felt on the threshold of a new religion when he walked on the Brooklyn Bridge, in the presence of a new divinity. That new divinity for Stella was one created by human beings. Its attributes were strength, newness, clarity, light, power, speed. For him, these were present above all in America, not in nature, but in the cities where human potential could be best fulfilled. The priests in his new society would be artists, and its devotional objects would be the artist's creations. The bridge panel is far simpler and clearer than the first version. It's organized into a view framed by the 2 arches. It's become more of a proclamation and celebration, much clarified, and very far from the ambiguous and troubled picture he'd finished when he began all over again and painted the one on the right. And the mysterious jewel has disappeared. In the Whitney version of 1939, finally, there's more color and incident. There's skyscrapers, and there's glimpses of hellish red pushed to the side, and a fringe on top. Also a subtitle with a touch of wit: The Brooklyn Bridge, Variation on an Old Theme. The Boston painting of 1941 comes as a surprise because Stella returns to his original life-changing composition of 22 years before and makes no bones about it, doing so with his title, Old Brooklyn Bridge. It has a very different look. Like the others, it's sharper and more emphatic in its colors and its contrasts. Stella has replaced the dangers and the hesitations and the fears that he embodied in the first version with what feels something like confidence. He's 63, in bad health, with just 5 years or less of that to live, but I'd like to think taking satisfaction in his own survival and that of his vision of Brooklyn Bridge, with all of its enduring energy and magnetism. The last lecture in the series is a return to the realist tradition in America. Hopper's paintings has surprises, though, for anybody who falls for its pleasing simplicity. So please come back and see for yourselves. Thank you.